Many people still think that black people have only recently settled in Britain. We are seen as the new immigrants who arrived here after the Second World War. In fact, people from Africa, Asia and the West Indies have a very long history as settlers in Britain. In this programme, we want to focus on the 450-year presence of black people in Britain before 1950, the difficulties we faced, our achievements, and our contribution to many facets of British life. It's likely that many of the facts and images presented here will be new to you. Why? Because our earlier presence here has usually been quietly left out, ignored, forgotten, dismissed, at best painted in the background, in the shadows. In the last few years, more and more people have been taking a second look, a long, hard, critical look at this history, throwing light on the treatment of black people, not just showing how they survived, but also bringing their life stories into the foreground, highlighting them, giving them the balanced exposure they deserve. This programme tries to pay tribute both to the efforts of these committed researchers and to the subjects of their research.
We'll start off by looking at how black people arrived in Britain and why they settled. In the late 15th century, King James IV of Scotland imitated other kings in Europe by introducing African retainers to his court. By 1510, the records show there was an established black community in Edinburgh. The first record of black people in England at this time refers to the black trumpeter employed by Henry VII in 1507. He later worked for Henry VIII, and you can see the black trumpeter on this record of the great tournament of 1511. In the 1570s, Queen Elizabeth I was portrayed with what appeared to be a group of 12 black musicians and dancers at her court at Hunsdon Place on the Thames. The first English sea captain to traffic in slaves was John Hawkins. In 1562, he kidnapped 300 Africans from the Guinea coast and transported them to Hispaniola, later known as Haiti. Slaves made Hawkins and his sponsors, who included Queen Elizabeth, a great amount of money. Hawkins based his crest on the motif of a bound slave. In the next 150 years, many millions of Africans were kidnapped and transported either to their deaths at sea or to a life of bondage in the Americas. At the same time, many were brought to England by sea captains like Hawkins. Just who all these slaves were bought by and what their various fates were, we don't yet know. Certainly, black slaves gave status and a visible symbol of power to the wealthier of their owners, many of whom would have been absentee landlords of plantations in the West Indies, or traders like the Lascelles, who built Harwood House in Yorkshire out of their Caribbean profits. But then, as only the rich could afford portraits like these to be made, they may not be giving us a balanced picture of what must have been widespread use of black slaves at the time. The painter and engraver Hogarth satirized the desire for exotic black servants in many of his works, as in this engraving called Taste in High Life. Not all slaves were African. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted a charter to the East India Company, giving it a monopoly of trade with India and the East. The company gradually built up its political and military control to the extent that by the 1850s it ruled a large part of India for Britain. By 1621, the company was selling Indian slaves in London, and so began a steady influx of poor Indian slaves, servants and sailors to Britain, caught up in the global movement of people, produce and profit. By the 18th century, Asians were arriving in Britain in considerable numbers as a direct result of Britain's colonial exploits. The majority were from India and were not slaves. From the early 1700s, it became a custom for rich British families to bring back servants and nannies in order to recreate at home something of the splendors of their life in India. Queen Victoria employed several Indian servants in her household, including Abdul Karim, who she promoted to be her Indian secretary, and as such, he gave her lessons in Hindustani. Several country houses were built in England by families influenced by Indian architecture. This is Sezencote House in Gloucestershire, built in 1805 by Sir Charles Cockerell, who made a fortune in the service of the East India Company. But all too often, the Indian nanny or ayah, employed just for the long voyage home from India, would be discarded and abandoned once in Britain. The ayah's home in East London was finally set up by missionary bodies to provide a temporary home for destitute ayahs awaiting re-engagement as nannies, either in Britain or in ships bound for India. By the second half of the 18th century, the total black population of Britain ran into tens of thousands. This contemporary newspaper suggests that it numbered 20,000 in London alone. Clearly, a significant number of these black people were free individuals of independent means. The London Chronicle in 1764 gives an account of a fashionable club in Fleet Street at which
no whites were allowed to be present, for all the performers were black.
At the end of the 18th century, there were many lascars or sailors from India and China in London. Navigation acts were passed in the 18th century stating that all ships coming in and out from English ports must have a crew 75% English. Due to the shortage of English sailors during the Napoleonic Wars, sailors were press-ganged in the Indian Ocean as well as in England, and the rules were changed. A law was passed in 1803 stating that only a quarter of the crew needed to be English on merchant ships. Lascars were paid only 1/6 of European rates of pay and were frequently ill-treated, sometimes with appalling cruelty. By the 1840s, over 10,000 Lascars a year were arriving in British ports. Some jumped ship because of ill treatment and stayed in Britain. During the Victorian period, increasing numbers of more prosperous Indians, Africans and West Indians arrived in Britain. Many came as students in law or medicine, others to train as teachers. Indians came to take the exam for entry into the Indian civil service, for which even an Indian university education was considered by the British to be insufficient. Some of these stayed and made their home in Britain. They helped build up the growing middle class and professional communities of black people, which included teachers of Asian and African languages, doctors, merchants, and traders. In this century, 2 world wars brought many thousands of black people from Asia, Africa, and the West Indies to Britain and the rest of Europe. In fact, about 1 soldier in 3 who fought on the British side in both wars were from the Commonwealth, and about 1 in 8 were black. Many wounded and crippled black soldiers were brought to Britain for treatment in military hospitals, such as the Pavilion and Dome Hospital in Brighton. This monument on the South Downs near Brighton is dedicated to the 1.5 million Indian troops who fought in the First World War. In the Second World War, even more black men and women came to help voluntarily in the fight against Nazism. Often they paid their own fares to get to Britain. Many technicians came to work in Britain's factories and shipyards, making an invaluable contribution to the final victory. Voluntary donations from the Commonwealth included ambulances from the Caribbean for use by war casualties. The post-war labour shortage led to overseas recruiting campaigns in the late 40s and 50s, and many thousands of black people came to work in Britain, some of whom had seen war service in the United Kingdom. Most of these black people have settled here and have had children and grandchildren, the latest black British in a line which stretches back to that first black community in Edinburgh.
So these are some of the ways in which black people have arrived in Britain over the last 5 centuries. For most black people, life here has been a hard struggle to resist oppression, poverty, and discrimination. The first struggle was against the terrible practice of slavery, from which Britain was to profit so handsomely. The Atlantic slave trade has been called the largest forced transportation of human beings from one part of the globe to another in the world's history, involving perhaps as many as 40 million slaves. Providing, as it did, crucial underpinning of Britain's industrial revolution, is it little wonder that slavery was to endure here in England for over 2 centuries.
Many British ports grew dramatically in size on the strength of the triangular trade in slaves, sugar, and manufactured goods between Britain, West Africa, and the Caribbean. This painting shows the port of Liverpool in the late 18th century. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, Bristol grew to become the 2nd largest English city after London, preceding Liverpool as the centre of the slave trade. The first resistance to slavery came from the many slaves who ran away from their masters. Newspapers of the late 17th and 18th centuries contain many adverts from slave owners seeking runaway slaves. During the early 1700s, slaves who were baptized as Christians began to consider themselves free. This is the grave of one such slave. York and Talbot delivered their judgment.
We are of the opinion that a slave, by coming from the West Indies to Great Britain or Ireland, either with or without his master, does not become free, and that his master's property or right in him is not thereby determined or varied, and that baptism does not bestow freedom on him, nor make any alteration in his temporal condition in these kingdoms. We are also of the opinion that his master may legally compel him to return again to the plantations.
Despite this ruling, some slaves were gaining their freedom, often by buying it. Ignatius Sancho began life as a slave in the West Indies. As a young boy, he was brought to England in 1731, still a slave. In 1749, he was employed as butler to the Duchess of Montague at Montague House on Blackheath. On her death, he gained his freedom, an immediate inheritance of £70 and an annuity of £30. He married a West Indian and ran a grocer's shop in Westminster. Sancho was a notable playwright and poet. His portrait was painted by Gainsborough, and after his death, his letters were published in a book which had enormous sales. Francis Barber was born in Jamaica and brought to England in 1750 by a Captain Bathurst, who gave Francis his freedom in his will. Francis then became a servant to Dr. Samuel Johnson, author of the first English dictionary. He lived with the Johnson household in London and is also believed to have accompanied the doctor on his frequent visits to Thrale House on Streatham Common. Johnson was clearly very fond of his servant and paid out £300 to educate him. On his death, Johnson left Francis his property, books and personal possessions, and an annuity of £50. Francis married an Englishwoman and moved to Burntwood near Lichfield, where he ran a school until his death in 1801. Olaudah Equiano was taken from the Benin coast at the age of 10. He was a slave in England, Barbados and Virginia. In 1759, he was baptized at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster, and in 1766, he purchased his freedom. Olaudah was determined to fight slavery. In 1789, he wrote his life story, which was extensively used in the anti-slavery campaign. He travelled widely throughout Britain, speaking against slavery. The cause of black people was also taken up by Granville Sharp, who worked closely with the black community in bringing cases to court in order to establish rights within the law. The most famous of these was the Somerset case. In 1771, James Somerset, a slave brought from America by his master, escaped and sheltered in London's black community. He was apprehended by his master and put in chains aboard a ship about to return to the plantations. Somerset's friends in Granville Sharp obtained a writ of habeas corpus against the ship's captain, and the whole matter was referred to the Court of King's Bench for decision. After lengthy vacillation, the Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, finally freed Somerset and established the principle that slaves could not be returned to the plantations by force. As this 1786 entry in Sharp's own diary shows, the Somerset case did not mark the end of slavery in Britain, but it was a significant step towards its eventual abolition. The black community were euphoric.
On Monday, near 200 blacks with their ladies had an entertainment at a public house in Westminster to celebrate the triumph which their brother Somerset had obtained over Mr. Stuart, his master. Lord Mansfield's health was echoed around the room, and the evening was concluded with a ball.
In many people's minds, the abolitionist movement was led by white humanitarian men such as William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp. In reality, the movement was far broader. Though not permitted to speak at anti-slavery society meetings, women made up roughly a third of the movement's ranks and campaigned actively by boycotting sugar and cotton from the plantations. Black people, too, played an important role in the campaign. The popular and influential publications of the anti-slavery lobby included the 1840 autobiography, recently rediscovered and reprinted, of Mary Prince, who recounted her own harrowing experiences as a slave in the Caribbean. And mass public meetings such as this gathering in 1841 at Exeter Hall showed the strength of growing working-class opposition to slavery worldwide. The British slave trade was made illegal in 1807, though it still continued to operate outside the law. In 1833, slavery as such was finally outlawed in British colonies, but many of its practices continued under the apprenticeship system.
If slavery enabled a white elite to make fortunes out of the collective victimization of black people, both poor black people and white people were pushed down to the bottom rung of the social ladder by the same unequal economic system. Most black people in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries shared the poverty of most white people. For the working class, life was grindingly harsh, terrible living conditions, illness, hunger, and even starvation were the norm.
Large numbers of poor people were employed as crossing sweepers to sweep a clean path across the streets for rich people. Certainly some black people worked as crossing sweepers. Many other black people earned a living as street traders. One of the most famous was Dr. Bukanki, a street herbalist. Many black men had to earn a living in the British Army or Navy, especially during the American War of Independence and the Napoleonic Wars. This black drummer was serving in the Grenadier Guards in about 1790. In this engraving of the death of Nelson at Trafalgar, a black sailor is shown as part of the battle scene. Throughout the 19th century, a number of blacks earned a living as prize fighters. Perhaps the most famous was Tom Molyneux, who in 1810 fought Tom Cribb for the English heavyweight championship, only losing because of a trick by his opponent. Some black people became street musicians and dancers, as shown in this group from about 1820. Others sold Christian tracts or advertised products or public events. In the 1850s, Henry Mayhew found at least 20 black people earning their living in this way on the streets of London. In London, many black people lived alongside a large Irish community in St. Giles in the East End. In this 1820s engraving by the Cruikshank brothers, poor black and white people share their relaxation in an East London tavern.
One experience has been common to all black people over the last 500 years, whether they were poor or prosperous, powerless or powerful, whether their origins were Asia or Africa. All of us have had to struggle against prejudice and discrimination, and it's a struggle that has by no means ended.
In the last decades of Elizabeth I's reign, conditions for the poorer classes were very harsh. There was widespread famine, and the government's resources for dealing with the resulting social problems were severely taxed. In 1601, Elizabeth issued a royal proclamation which called for the expulsion of black people, labeling them as scapegoats for the country's ills. This at a time when England's wealthy were enriching themselves from the very trade that brought black people into this country. Black people were often the victims of racial abuse, either of the kind shown in this contemporary drawing or of the kind recorded by Ignatius Sancho in his diary.
They supped us in town and most generously insulted us.
Black people faced discrimination in employment. They were expected to be servants. In 1731, the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London issued an ordinance forbidding the apprenticeship of any Negroes to tradesmen or artificers in the city. In 1786, Henry Smithman initiated a voluntary scheme to establish a settlement on the coast of Sierra Leone for poor black Londoners. Olaudah Equiano at first supported the scheme, but he soon found that the supplies were being misappropriated by city officials and that the agent was corrupt. Equiano spoke out and was dismissed from his job and attacked in the press. Later, he was vindicated. The mayor and other city authorities, disappointed at the poor response, tried to force poor black people onto the ships, whether signatories or not. It wasn't the first time expulsion had been attempted as a solution to the presence of black settlers here, nor, of course, would it be the last. Inevitably, over 200 years of British involvement in slavery left its mark on our attitudes towards the peoples of Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. A sense of racial superiority was positively developed during the Victorian period, when Africans and Asians were often presented to the British public as curious exhibits. At one open-air exhibition on the slopes of the Alexandra Palace in London in September 1877, an entrance fee was charged to view the animals and people of Nubia. The Illustrated London News explained,
The introduction of these men and their various captives of the chase into civilized Europe is due to the enterprise of Mr. Karl Hagenbach of Hamburg. Having long been in the habit of sending periodically to Nubia for his elephants, giraffes, ostriches, dromedaries and other zoological pets, he conceived the notion of fetching thence a few specimens of the humanity employed by his agents in the collection of game. They are tall, slim, active men with dark skins, splendid white teeth and fantastically arranged hair. And robed in their loose cotton dresses, they present a decidedly picturesque appearance.
In the First World War, Britain had been saved by sailors willing to run the gauntlet of submarines and bring food and other essential supplies to the beleaguered island. Many of these sailors were black, as can be seen in this photograph of a crew. A backlash against black workers was not long in coming. Just a year after the war, riots broke out against black seamen at several British ports, including London, Liverpool, Newport and Cardiff. In the 1920s, unemployment among seamen was high, and the Seamen's Union wanted to restrict employment to British seamen. In 1925, the government introduced a law which made it difficult for aliens to work on British ships. In 1931, the League of Coloured Peoples was formed to expose the situation facing black people in Britain. The League began to campaign to restore the rights of black British seamen. It took several years of campaigning to win justice for the black seamen. Only in 1938 did the National Union of Seamen give support to those black seamen who had been discriminated against. It was a similar story with the nurses. In the early 1930s, most hospitals would not employ black nurses. Pressure from the League changed this gradually, but even so, in 1938, there were 18 hospitals which refused to train black women. Black people continued to face discrimination at all levels of society. Larry Constantine was a member of the West Indies cricket team in the 1920s and 30s. He settled in Britain in 1929 and during the war was employed by the Ministry of Labour as a welfare officer for West Indian workers. In 1944, Constantine claimed compensation from the owners of the Imperial Hotel in London because he had been asked to leave the hotel on account of his colour. He won his case and was able to demonstrate that black people were facing overt racial discrimination. After the Second World War, new immigrants in particular were met with widespread hostility and discrimination in jobs and housing. Constantine became a barrister and continued to expose discrimination. In the 1960s, he was a member of the Race Relations Board and was made a peer in 1969, Britain's first West Indian member of the House of Lords.
Black people are still struggling, just as our predecessors have struggled for nearly 500 years in Britain. At every level of society and in all our major institutions, the fight against prejudice and racism has to go on. On the way, as part of our struggle to be accepted, black people have made considerable, but often unrecognised, contributions to British society. We've already seen how people like Olaudah Equiano and Mary Prince fought for freedom and justice. Let's look at the contributions of other black men and women.
In the 1850s, Britain fought a major war against Russia in the Crimea. During this war, one nurse, Florence Nightingale, established a reputation for herself that's lasted until today. This official portrait of her contrasts with a poor cartoon depicting another dedicated Crimea nurse who has almost been forgotten. Mary Seacole was a Jamaican nurse who had nursed British troops during an outbreak of yellow fever in Jamaica. Hearing that these same men had been sent to the Crimea, Mary Seacole decided to follow them. Arriving in London, she applied to the War Office and other agencies as a nurse. No one would accept her. So at the age of 50, she paid her own way to the Crimea, where she set up a store and hotel and practiced her nursing skills. Her courage and devotion won her widespread admiration, including that of military surgeons and war correspondents. Mary served in the thick of the fighting and helped the wounded and dying at Redden, Chernaya and Sebastopol, and also nursed the victims of a cholera epidemic. She came back to London, famous but bankrupt. Well-wishers, including former commanders of the Crimea, organized a 4-day music festival to raise funds for her. Over 1,000 performers took part. Mary published her memoirs and lived in London until her death at the age of 76. She was a devout Christian and is buried in St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Paddington. Black people have made a contribution to trade, industry and the professions. Ignatius Sancho and his wife, running their grocers in Charles Street, Westminster, were among the first in a long line of black shopkeepers. Sheikh Dean Mohammed established a vapor bath at Brighton, where he pioneered the treatment of muscular ailments. Patients came from all over Britain and even Europe. His most famous patient was King George IV. Muhammad's business flourished, and in 1830 he was able to open a second establishment in the fashionable St. James area of London. After his retirement, two of his sons carried on Muhammad's business, while a third ran a fencing academy in Brighton. A number of black people became prominent in the professions. Sir Mancher G. Bownagree was a prosperous barrister who between 1895 and 1905 represented Bethnal Green as a Tory Member of Parliament. Others were successful industrialists like Dadabhai Naoroji, who came to Britain in 1855 as a partner in an Indian commercial firm. 4 years later, he set up his own cotton company. Between 1892 and 95, Naoroji was the Liberal Member of Parliament for Finsbury Central, the first black MP in the House of Commons. In the face of the growing public prejudice against black people during the Victorian era, the gifted actor Ira Aldridge performed in famous theatres throughout Britain. But his greatest successes came from continental tours, where he gained many medals and honours. Ranjit Singh, later Maharaja of Nawanagar, came to Britain in 1888 at the age of 16. As a student at Cambridge University, Ranjit Singh developed into a brilliant cricketer. He subsequently became captain of the Sussex County team and also played for England. He was the first of a long line of black sportsmen and women to represent England. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was born in 1875, was one of Britain's outstanding young composers. At the age of 23, he achieved fame for his great work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, which was described by the Royal College of Music in 1898 as one of the most remarkable events in English musical history. He went on to become Professor of Theory and Harmony at the Crystal Palace School of Music and regular conductor of the Croydon Conservatory Orchestra. Coleridge Taylor was very proud of his African heritage and incorporated black traditional music into his compositions. This cultural sympathy was paralleled by his consistent support for the Pan-African movement. When he died at the tragically young age of 37, one of the wreaths at the composer's funeral was in the shape of a map of Africa. It came from the sons and daughters of West Africa at present residing in England. A friend of Coleridge Taylor's and fellow veteran of the 1900 Pan-African Conference was the Trinidad-born physician, Pan-Africanist and devout Catholic, Dr. John Alcindor. After graduating from the University of Edinburgh Medical School in 1899 with first-class honours in 3 subjects, Alcindor settled in London in 1907, and in 1917 was appointed one of the Borough of Paddington's 4 district medical officers. By the 1920s, he was a well-known and respected figure in the Paddington area, affectionately called the Black Doctor of Paddington. Working from his surgery in the Harrow Road, Alcindor gave free medical treatment to those too poor to pay, and on numerous occasions returned home only to take away his dinner, saying, "My patient needs feeding, not doctoring." After his death in 1924, his family lived on in the Paddington area, continuing to provide a base for meetings of the African Progress Union, of which John Alcindor had been a very active president. Black people have made unique contributions to politics in Britain. William Cuffey was one of the principal leaders of the Chartist movement, the first mass political movement of the British working class, Cuffay worked as a tailor and lived in Chatham in Kent. The Chartists fought for the rights of working men, including the right to vote. During the 1840s, the growing power of the Chartists threatened the established order and earned the antagonism of most of the press. In August 1848, Cuffay and other leaders were arrested and put on trial. In his final speech, Cuffay showed great dignity and courage while continuing to defy the government. He was transported to Tasmania for life. Black women have played key roles in the struggle for women's rights. At the age of 23, Cornelia Sorabji became the first ever woman law student at a British university when she enrolled at Somerville Hall, Oxford in 1889. She gained her degree in civil law, but because of her sex, was barred from the legal profession. Finally, in 1922, after the bar was open to women, she became a member of Lincoln's Inn and was called to the bar in 1923. Few women will be aware that a deputation of Indian women played their part in a women's suffrage march in London in 1912. John Richard Archer was born in Liverpool in 1863. With his Canadian-born wife, whose name we cannot trace, he came to live in London as a student and then set up his own photography business in Battersea. This was their home in Bryn Mawr Road, and John was to remain in Battersea until his death at the age of 68. Archer was a practicing Roman Catholic and a member of the Labour Party. As a councillor for Battersea for over 20 years, he was deeply involved in serving the local community. In 1913, he was elected Mayor of Battersea, the first black mayor of Britain, who was also born here. In his opening speech to the council, he answered all those who objected to his election on the grounds of his colour.
I shall be glad to know if a man born under the Union Jack, whoever he is, has not the same rights as the white man. The colour of the skin cannot alter the affection of the heart. They have said I am a man of colour. I am. I am proud to be. I would not change my colour if I could.
Mayor Archer attended functions at Mansion House and was also presented at court. Archer was also committed to the struggles of African peoples. He participated in the Pan-African movement and was for 3 years president of the African Progress Union. His dedication to Battersea is only now finally beginning to be recognized and repaid in public tributes dedicated to him by the local community. Shapurji Saklatvala came to England in 1905 at the age of 31. Until his death from heart failure in 1936, Saklatvala lived out his passionate concern for social justice. He was active in the foundation of the Communist Party and was deeply involved in the trades union movement. In 1922, Saklatvala became the third Indian to become a Member of Parliament when he was elected as Communist MP for Battersea North. In 1924, at the age of 28, Krishna Menon came to London to study for a teaching diploma. He stayed in Britain, studying and writing till 1947, the year of India's independence. During more than 20 years' residence in Britain, Menon devoted his time to two things above all else: Indian independence and the London borough of St. Pancras. He was an eloquent speaker, and his passion and intensity about the justice of India's cause won him the support of many. In November 1934, Menon was elected a Labour councillor for St Pancras. He was so popular that he was returned with an increased majority at each subsequent election till 1947, when he resigned from the council on being appointed High Commissioner for newly independent India. In recognition of his services to St Pancras Borough, Camden Council conferred on Menon the honour of the freedom of the borough in 1955, and in 1974 reconfirmed their tribute with a plaque outside Menon's old home in Camden Square. While Menon was campaigning for full independence for India, George Padmore represented a new generation of young black radicals who did much to bring about the end of colonialism in Africa and the West Indies. Padmore, who has been called the father of African emancipation, exerted a strong influence on rising young African and West Indian political leaders from 1935 until his death in 1959. By the strength of his personality and by means of articles in several books, lectures, contributions to discussions, and a wide circle of personal contacts. Alongside others more well known today than himself, Padmore helped to organize the fifth and most important of all Pan-African Congresses, which issued from Manchester in the autumn of 1945 a clarion call for colonial freedom. The group had managed to assemble, here in Chorlton Town Hall, what was to become the future political leadership of British territories in Africa just 15 years later. Manchester had already become quite a point of contact with black workers in Britain, and in the group's own words, we had made a name there for ourselves in fighting various areas of discrimination. You could say that we coloured people had a right there because of the age-old connections between cotton, slavery, and the building up of cities in England. As we've already seen, black doctors as well as nurses and ancillary workers have played an important role in the medical service. Dr. Harold Moody was the founder of the League of Coloured Peoples. He had come to England in 1904 to be a medical student at King's College Hospital. He excelled there and specialized in ophthalmics. After qualifying as a doctor, he was unable to get a hospital job, so he established a family practice in Peckham, South London. Moody was determined to see that black people had equal rights and opportunities. His home in Peckham became a meeting place for black people, both British and overseas visitors. Moody was president of the London Missionary Society, president of Christian Endeavour, and a deacon in the Congregational Church. He spent weekends preaching in towns all over Britain. When Harold Moody died in 1947, thousands of people paid their respects at his funeral.
This, then, is a brief account of the history of black settlers in Britain up to the 1950s. It's a story of men, women, and children heroically struggling to survive in the face of great difficulties and to secure their rightful place in British society. It's a story of black people who have made and are still making important contributions to the development of that society. Sadly, it's also a story of how these contributions have gone unrecognized. Much written history has omitted the contributions of women. Unfortunately, at this time, there are few known images of black women and little record of their lives. This rediscovery of Britain's black history is a huge task, and it's only just begun. Some of the things we presented in this programme will be common knowledge in a few years' time. You can join in this process of rediscovery yourself by carefully looking at pictures and stories of women and men from our past and our present in a bright new light.
To annihilate them. And there came an end to Christianity in these lands, an eclipse so final and complete that the world forgot, almost till now, that Christian Nubia had ever existed. Yet distant echoes of that long-lost epic can still be caught on the winds of history and in unexpected places. The Cathedral of Magdeburg, a famous capital of medieval Germany. From here, in the year 1228, the German Emperor Frederick led out his knights on the Sixth Crusade. And a few years later, a new statue was raised to the patron saint of Magdeburg, St. Maurice. Astonishingly, but beyond question, an entirely black St. Maurice. Until then, the many statues of St. Maurice around Western Europe had invariably shown this military saint as white. But here at Magdeburg, St. Maurice suddenly became black. Unmistakably, to my mind, the Black Knight of Christian Nubia, Christ's warrior from the distant south. So here his noble figure stands to this day, certainly the most important, perhaps the most moving sculpture of an African in all the history of European art. It was created and set up in this great German cathedral to honor the fame and virtue of an African friend and ally, different in face and form, but just as surely equal in dignity and human worth.
Next week at the same time, Basil Davidson shows how the African peoples established farming settlements hundreds of years ago. And he's also written a book called Africa, based on this series, which is available in the shops for £8.95. Also, if you'd like the free study guide, which gives details of the programmes and of Africa-related events around the country, plus book lists and other information,